My name is Jessica Thompson, and I'm 22 years old. For 3 years, I endured my stepmother Rachel's psychological torment while my father turned a blind eye to her cruelty. But when she took scissors to my waist-length hair and chopped it all off in a fit of rage, claiming I needed a trim, I thought my world had ended. What I didn't know was that Linda Martinez, the salon owner I ran to in tears, would become my unlikely savior when she took one look at my butchered hair and immediately called the police. That single phone call would unravel years of hidden abuse and lead to the most satisfying justice I could have ever imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My story begins not with my stepmother, but with my grandmother Helen, the woman who raised me to believe that family meant unconditional love and protection. After my mother died in a car accident when I was just 7 years old, Grandma Helen became my everything. She lived in a cozy Victorian house on Elmwood Drive, filled with the scent of fresh-baked cookies and the sound of her gentle laughter. Every weekend I would spend time with her, learning to braid friendship bracelets, tend to her rose garden, and most importantly, care for my hair. My hair was Grandma Helen's pride and joy. She would spend hours each Sunday evening brushing my long dark waves, teaching me how to braid it properly, and sharing stories about how my mother's hair had been just as beautiful. It became our special ritual, sitting in her bedroom while she worked coconut oil through my strands and told me about the women in our family who had treasured their hair as a symbol of their strength and femininity. By the time I turned 18, my hair reached my waist, thick and healthy from years of her careful attention. It wasn't just hair to me, it was my connection to my mother, my grandmother, and the loving tradition they had passed down to me. When my father David met Rachel at a conference 3 years ago, everything in our small Riverside, Ohio home began to change. Dad had been a devoted single father since Mom's death, working as an accountant at the local firm while making sure I never felt unloved or neglected. We had our routines, our inside jokes, our quiet dinners where he would ask about my day at Riverside Community College where I was studying early childhood education. He was gentle, patient, and always made me feel like his priority. That version of my father started disappearing the moment Rachel walked into our lives. Rachel was 35, blonde, and possessed the kind of sharp beauty that commanded attention. She worked in marketing for a pharmaceutical company and carried herself with a confidence that seemed to intimidate my father into submission. From the very first time Dad brought her to our house on Maple Street, I sensed something calculating about the way she surveyed our home, taking mental notes of everything from the family photos on the mantelpiece to the comfortable furniture that had been carefully chosen over the years. She smiled at me during that first meeting, but her eyes remained cold, appraising, as if she were measuring me as a potential obstacle to overcome. The changes started subtly. Dad began canceling our weekend movie nights because Rachel had made plans for them. He stopped asking about my classes and started talking exclusively about Rachel's latest work projects or her opinions on everything from the local restaurants to the color of our living room walls. When they announced their engagement after just 8 months of dating, I tried to be supportive despite the growing knot in my stomach. I wanted my father to be happy, and I convinced myself that I could learn to accept Rachel as part of our family. The wedding was a small affair at the Garden Bistro downtown, with Rachel's family flying in from California and a handful of Dad's colleagues attending. I wore a navy blue dress that Grandma Helen had helped me pick out, and I smiled through the ceremony even though something felt fundamentally wrong about watching my father promise to love someone who had never once asked him about my mother or shown any interest in the daughter he had raised alone for over a decade. During the reception, Rachel made a point of introducing me to her relatives as David's daughter, never using my name, as if I were simply an accessory that came with her new husband rather than a person with my own identity and history. The real Rachel emerged gradually after they returned from their honeymoon in Mexico. She moved into our house with an efficiency that was almost military in its precision, reorganizing our kitchen cabinets, replacing family photos with new pictures of herself and Dad, and establishing new household rules that somehow always seemed designed to make my life more difficult. She convinced Dad that we needed to eat dinner together every night as a family, but then used these meals as opportunities to criticize everything from my table manners to my career aspirations. During one particularly uncomfortable dinner about 6 months after the wedding, Rachel looked across the table at me with that familiar cold smile and said, "Jessica, don't you think it's time you started taking better care of your appearance? That hair of yours is getting quite unruly." Dad looked up from his plate, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation but said nothing. I had learned by then that defending myself only led to longer lectures about respect and family dynamics, so I simply nodded and continued eating my mashed potatoes in silence. The criticism became a constant undercurrent in our daily interactions. Rachel would comment on my clothing choices, suggesting that I dressed too casually for someone my age. She questioned my study habits, implying that I was wasting time on a degree that would never lead to financial success. Most painfully, she began making subtle digs about my hair, calling it old-fashioned and suggesting that I was holding on to childhood habits that no longer served me. Each comment was delivered with a sweet smile and a tone that made it impossible for me to object without seeming oversensitive or disrespectful. When Rachel became pregnant with Emma, the dynamic in our house shifted even more dramatically. Suddenly, every conversation revolved around the coming baby, the nursery preparations, and Rachel's needs during her pregnancy. Dad became completely absorbed in his role as an expectant father, doting on Rachel in ways that made me feel invisible in my own home. I tried to be excited about having a little sister, and part of me genuinely was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this baby would be the final step in my complete displacement from my father's affections. Emma was born on a crisp October morning, and despite all my complicated feelings about Rachel, I fell in love with my baby sister immediately. She was perfect, with tiny fingers that would grasp onto mine and dark hair that reminded me of my own baby pictures. For a brief period, I thought having Emma might bring some peace to our household. Rachel seemed mellower during those first few weeks, focused entirely.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Entirely on the baby, and less interested in her usual passive-aggressive campaigns against me. But as Emma grew from infant to toddler, Rachel's behavior toward me became increasingly hostile. She began making comments about how the baby needed stability and consistency, implying that my presence in the house was somehow disruptive to Emma's development. She suggested that I was too loud when I came home from my evening classes, that my weekend visits with Grandma Helen were setting a bad example of divided loyalties, and that my study materials cluttered the common areas in ways that weren't appropriate for a house with a small child. The most hurtful development was watching my father gradually adopt Rachel's perspective on everything. Dad had always been proud of my academic achievements, but now he seemed embarrassed when I mentioned my dean's list status or my plans to transfer to a four-year university. He started suggesting that I consider more practical career paths, echoing Rachel's frequent comments about the financial challenges facing teachers and social workers. When I tried to talk to him privately about my concerns, he would dismiss them as adjustment difficulties and remind me that Rachel was now part of our family and deserved my respect and cooperation. My relationship with Grandma Helen became my lifeline during this increasingly difficult period. Every Sunday, I would drive across town to her house on Elmwood Drive, where she would make her famous chocolate chip cookies, and we would sit in her garden while she listened to my frustrations without judgment. She could see the toll that living with Rachel was taking on me, and she frequently offered to let me move in with her. But I wasn't ready to give up on my father or abandon my little sister to Rachel's influence without trying to make things work. The breaking point came on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday evening in March. I had just returned from my child psychology class at the community college, excited to share some insights I had gained about early childhood development that I thought might be helpful with Emma. I found Rachel in the kitchen, preparing dinner while Emma played with blocks on the floor nearby. Dad was still at work, having told us he would be late due to tax season demands at his accounting firm. I started telling Rachel about what I had learned in class, genuinely hoping to bridge some of the distance between us by showing interest in Emma's development. Rachel listened with what I thought was unusual attention, nodding occasionally and asking a few questions about specific concepts. I felt encouraged by her engagement, thinking that perhaps we were finally finding some common ground through our shared love for Emma. But as I continued talking, I noticed Rachel's expression beginning to change. Her initial interest was transforming into something that looked suspiciously like irritation, though I couldn't understand why. When I mentioned that my professor had discussed the importance of consistent caregiving and stable home environments for toddlers, Rachel's face darkened completely. "Are you suggesting that Emma doesn't have a stable home environment?" she asked, her voice taking on the sharp edge that I had learned to recognize as a warning sign. I quickly tried to clarify that I hadn't meant anything critical about our household, that I was simply sharing academic information that I found interesting. But Rachel was no longer listening to my explanations. She had fixed me with the cold stare that always preceded her most cutting remarks, and I braced myself for whatever verbal assault was coming. Jessica, she said slowly, setting down the wooden spoon she had been using to stir the soup, I think it's time someone explained something to you. This is my house now. Emma is my daughter. Your father is my husband. You are a grown woman who needs to stop interfering in family matters that don't concern you. I stood frozen in the doorway, holding my backpack and feeling the familiar heat of humiliation rising in my cheeks. Emma continued playing with her blocks, oblivious to the tension crackling between her mother and her half-sister. I wanted to respond, to defend myself, to point out that this had been my home for 15 years before Rachel had even entered our lives. But I had learned that any attempt to stand up for myself only escalated these confrontations into dramatic scenes that somehow always ended with Dad taking Rachel's side. Instead, I apologized quietly and started to leave the kitchen, hoping to retreat to my bedroom until Dad came home and the atmosphere returned to its usual level of polite coldness. But Rachel wasn't finished with me. And another thing, she called after me, her voice rising slightly, I'm tired of looking at that ridiculous hair of yours. It's completely inappropriate for a woman your age, and it makes you look like you're still 12 years old. Tomorrow you're getting it cut into something more mature and professional. I turned back to face her, my heart beginning to race. My hair was the one thing I had managed to keep safe from Rachel's criticism and control. It was my connection to my mother and grandmother, my reminder of who I was before Rachel had entered our lives and begun reshaping everything to suit her preferences. I like my hair the way it is, I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. Grandma Helen and I take care of it together, and it's important to me. Rachel's expression shifted into something I had never seen before, a kind of cold fury that made me take an involuntary step backward. She moved toward me with deliberate slowness, her eyes never leaving mine. Your grandmother is not part of this family, she said, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow more threatening than if she had been shouting. I am your mother now, and what I say goes. You will get your hair cut tomorrow, or I will cut it myself. The threat hung in the air between us like a live wire. I wanted to tell her that she would never be my mother, that she had no right to make demands about my appearance or my relationship with Grandma Helen. But Emma chose that moment to toddle over to us, reaching up toward Rachel with her arms outstretched, and I realized that any escalation of this conflict would happen in front of my baby sister. I left the kitchen without another word, climbed the stairs to my bedroom, and closed the door behind me. Sitting on my bed, I ran my fingers through my long hair and tried to figure out what to do. I considered calling Grandma Helen, but I knew she would insist that I come stay with her immediately, and I wasn't ready to abandon Emma or give up on the possibility that Dad might eventually see what Rachel was doing to our family. Instead, I decided to wait until Dad came home and talk to him privately about Rachel's ultimatum. Surely he would understand how important my hair was to me, how much it meant in terms of my connection to Mom and Grandma Helen. He had always been reasonable in the past, and I convinced myself that he would intervene if he understood the emotional significance of what Rachel was demanding. When I heard Dad's car pull into the driveway around 8 o'clock, I waited for him to get settled before approaching him in his home office where he was reviewing client files. He looked tired, stressed from the long hours he was working during tax season, but he smiled when he saw me in the doorway. Hey sweetheart, he said, taking off his reading glasses and rubbing his eyes. How was school today? I sat down in the chair across from his desk and tried to find the right words to explain what had happened with Rachel. I told him about her demand that I cut my hair, about the way she had dismissed Grandma Helen's role in my life, about the threat she had made if I didn't comply with her wishes. Dad listened quietly, his expression growing more troubled as I continued. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, and I felt hopeful that he was finally seeing the pattern of Rachel's behavior that I had been trying to make him understand for months. Jess, he said finally, using the nickname he had called me since childhood, I know this is difficult. Blending families is always challenging, and Rachel is still adjusting to having a stepdaughter. But maybe she has a point about your hair. You are 22 now, and if you're planning to start interviewing for teaching positions soon, a more professional appearance might be beneficial. I felt as though he had slapped me. This was my father, the man who had braided my hair for school pictures when I was 8, who had driven me to Grandma Helen's house every Sunday so we could maintain our hair care ritual, who had always told me I looked beautiful exactly as I was. Dad, I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking, this isn't about professional appearance, this is about Rachel trying to control every aspect of my life. She wants to cut my hair because she knows how much it means to me, not because she's concerned about my career prospects." He sighed and put his glasses back on, a gesture I recognized as his way of signaling that he was done with the conversation. "Rachel cares about this family, Jessica. She wants what's best for all of us. Maybe you should consider that she might be right about this." I left his office feeling more alone than I had since my mother's death. The one person I had counted on to protect me was now actively supporting the woman who seemed determined to erase every trace of who I had been before she arrived. That night, I lay in bed holding on to my hair like a security blanket, trying to figure out how to navigate the impossible situation I found myself in. The next morning, I woke up hoping that Rachel had forgotten about her ultimatum, or that Dad had spoken to her about backing down from her demands. But when I came downstairs for breakfast, I found her waiting for me in the kitchen with a pair of scissors in her hand and an appointment card for a local salon on the counter. "I called Serenity Hair Studio," she announced, her tone artificially cheerful. "You have an appointment at 10 o'clock this morning." I explained to Linda Martinez that you need a complete makeover, something more sophisticated and age-appropriate. I stared at the scissors in her hand, feeling a chill run down my spine. "I told you I don't want to cut my hair." Rachel's false smile disappeared instantly, "and I told you that what you want is no longer relevant. You live in my house, you follow my rules. Either you go to that appointment, or I handle this situation myself right now." She took a step toward me, raising the scissors slightly, and I realized with growing horror that she was completely serious. Dad had already left for work, Emma was still sleeping upstairs, and I was alone with a woman who seemed to have completely lost any sense of boundaries or appropriateness. "Rachel, please," I said, backing away from her toward the front door. "This is crazy, you can't force me to cut my hair." But she was advancing on me now, her eyes bright with something that looked almost like excitement. "Watch me," she said, and before I could react, she had grabbed a handful of my hair and was raising the scissors toward it. I screamed and jerked away from her, but Rachel's grip on my hair was surprisingly strong. The sound of the scissors cutting through my hair was like nothing I had ever heard before, a soft snipping that seemed to echo through the kitchen like gunshots. I felt chunks of my hair falling onto my shoulders, and the floor around my feet, years of careful growth disappearing in seconds. "Stop!" I cried out, trying to twist away from her, but she had positioned herself between me and the door, and every time I moved, she grabbed another section of hair and cut it off with vicious efficiency. There was something almost methodical about the way she was destroying my hair, as if she had been planning this moment for months and knew exactly how to inflict the maximum amount of damage. "You should have listened to me," she said through gritted teeth as she continued cutting. "You should have done what I told you to do. But no, you had to be stubborn. You had to make this difficult." The worst part wasn't the physical sensation of having my hair chopped off, though that was traumatic enough. It was the look of pure satisfaction on Rachel's face as she worked, the way her eyes lit up each time another chunk of hair hit the floor. She wasn't cutting my hair because she genuinely believed it would look better shorter. She was destroying it because she knew it would hurt me, because she understood that this was the one thing I had managed to keep safe from her influence, and she wanted to take that away from me too. When she finally stepped back, breathing hard from the exertion, I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflection of the kitchen window. What I saw made me feel physically sick. My beautiful long hair had been hacked off in jagged, uneven chunks. Some sections were barely an inch long, while others hung in strange, choppy pieces around my face. I looked like I had been attacked by a lawnmower, or like someone suffering from a severe mental breakdown had taken scissors to their own head. "There," Rachel said, setting the scissors down on the counter with a satisfied click. "Now you look more your age. I'll call the salon and cancel your appointment since we've already taken care of the problem." I stood frozen in place, staring at the enormous pile of dark hair scattered across the kitchen floor. Each strand represented hours of careful brushing with Grandma Helen, Sunday evenings spent learning about my mother and the women who had come before me, quiet moments of connection and love that Rachel had just destroyed in a matter of minutes. "Clean that up," she ordered, gesturing toward the hair on the floor. "I don't want Emma to see this mess when she wakes up." Something inside me finally snapped. All the months of walking on eggshells, of swallowing my pride and accepting Rachel's casual cruelties, of trying to preserve peace in a household where I was clearly unwanted, came rushing to the surface in a wave of pure rage. "You're insane," I said, my voice shaking with fury. "You're completely insane, and I'm going to tell Dad exactly what you did to me." Rachel laughed, a cold sound that made my skin crawl. "Go ahead and tell him." Tell him that you refused to follow a simple instruction about getting a haircut, that you forced me to handle the situation myself because you wouldn't listen to reason. See who he believes." The terrible thing was that I knew she was right. Dad had already made it clear the night before that he supported Rachel's position on my hair. When he saw what had happened, she would spin it as my fault for being defiant and forcing her hand. He would probably apologize to her for having to deal with such a difficult stepdaughter. I left the kitchen without cleaning up the hair, grabbed my car keys from the front hall table and walked out of the house. I didn't have a plan or a destination in mind. I just knew I couldn't stay in that house for another second, surrounded by the evidence of Rachel's cruelty and the echo of her satisfied laughter. I drove through Riverside with tears streaming down my face, catching glimpses of myself in the rearview mirror and feeling fresh waves of horror each time I saw what Rachel had done to me. My hair looked even worse in natural light, the uneven chunks creating a bizarre pattern of long and short sections that made me look like I belonged in a psychiatric facility, rather than walking around in public. Without really thinking about where I was going, I found myself pulling into the parking lot of Serenity Hair Studio on Main Street. Through the large windows, I could see Linda Martinez, the salon owner, working on a client's highlights while chatting animatedly about something that was making both of them laugh. The scene looked so normal, so peaceful, that I almost started crying again just from the contrast with the violence I had just experienced in my own kitchen. I sat in my car for several minutes, trying to work up the courage to go inside. Part of me wanted to drive straight to Grandma Helen's house and hide in her spare bedroom until I could figure out what to do next. But I knew that seeing my destroyed hair would break her heart, and I wasn't ready to explain what had happened or deal with her inevitable fury at Rachel and disappointment in my father. Finally, I forced myself to get out of the car and walk toward the salon entrance. I could see Linda looking up as I approached, and I watched her expression change from welcoming curiosity to shock and concern as she got a better look at my hair. By the time I pushed open the door, she was already moving toward me with the kind of focused attention that suggested she understood this was some kind of emergency. "Oh honey," she said softly, reaching out to gently touch one of the longer pieces of hair hanging near my ear. "What happened to you?" The kindness in her voice, so different from Rachel's cold satisfaction, made me start crying all over again. Linda immediately guided me to a chair in the back of the salon, away from the other clients, and brought me a box of tissues while I tried to compose myself enough to explain what had happened. "My stepmother," I managed to say between sobs. "She cut it all off this morning. She said I needed to look more professional, but really she just wanted to hurt me. She knew how much my hair meant to me, and she destroyed it on purpose." Linda's expression grew increasingly serious as I told her the story, her experienced eye examining the damage that Rachel had inflicted. She asked me to describe exactly how the incident had occurred, and I found myself recounting every detail from Rachel's ultimatum the night before to the moment I had fled the house that morning. "Jessica," Linda said when I finished, her voice gentle but firm, "what you're describing isn't just a family disagreement about hair length, this is assault. Someone forcibly cutting another person's hair without their consent is a crime, especially when it's done in the way you've described." I looked at her in surprise. In all my shock and upset about what Rachel had done, I hadn't considered the legal implications of her actions. I had been so focused on the emotional trauma and the destruction of something that had been precious to me that I hadn't thought about whether what she had done was actually illegal. "I don't think my dad would want me to press charges against his wife," I said hesitantly. "He's already made it clear that he thinks Rachel was right about me needing to cut my hair." Linda shook her head firmly. "This isn't about what your father wants or what anyone thinks about hair length. This is about one adult physically attacking another adult and causing intentional harm. Look at yourself in the mirror, honey. This isn't the result of a family disagreement. This is the result of someone using violence to control and humiliate you." She turned my chair so I was facing the large mirror that ran along the wall of the salon. Seeing my reflection in the bright professional lighting was even more shocking than it had been in my car. The damage was extensive and clearly intentional. No one could look at my hair and think it was the result of an accident or a simple disagreement about style. The jagged, uneven cuts spoke to a deliberate attempt to inflict maximum damage and humiliation. "I'm going to call the police," Linda said, already reaching for her phone. "What Rachel did to you is criminal assault, and you deserve to have it treated as such. No one should be able to do this to another person and face no consequences." I started to protest, worried about the drama this would cause in my family and the way it would affect Emma, but Linda held up her hand to stop me. "Jessica, I've been cutting hair for 30 years. I've seen women come in here with damage from domestic violence, from controlling partners, from family members who think they have the right to make decisions about other people's bodies. What happened to you today is part of a pattern of abuse, and it will only get worse if you don't take a stand now." Her words hit me like a physical blow. I had never thought of Rachel's behavior toward me as abuse. I had categorized it as personality conflicts, family adjustment issues, or simple dislike. But as I sat there looking at my destroyed hair and thinking back over the months of criticism, control, and escalating cruelty, I began to see the pattern that Linda was describing. Rachel hadn't just cut my hair
Because she thought it would look better shorter. She had done it because she knew it would devastate me. Because she understood that my hair represented my connection to my mother and grandmother, and because she wanted to demonstrate her power over me in the most visible and humiliating way possible. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare disguised as concern for my appearance. Linda was already dialing 911, explaining to the dispatcher that she had a young woman in her salon who had been the victim of an assault and needed police assistance. I listened to her calm, professional tone as she provided the salon's address and requested that officers come to take a report about what had happened. While we waited for the police to arrive, Linda examined my hair more closely, taking photographs of the damage from multiple angles with her phone. She explained that the photos would serve as evidence of the assault and would help document the extent of the harm that Rachel had caused. "The good news," she said as she worked, "is that hair grows back. It's going to take time, probably a couple of years to get back to the length you had, but this damage isn't permanent. The bad news is that we're going to have to cut quite a bit more off to even things out and give you a style that looks intentional rather than accidental." I nodded, understanding that the additional cutting was necessary but feeling another wave of grief at the thought of losing even more of my hair. Linda seemed to sense my distress and worked quickly but carefully, cutting away the most damaged sections and creating a short layered style that looked deliberate and flattering despite being far shorter than anything I had ever worn before. When Officer Ryan Burke arrived at the salon about 20 minutes later, I was surprised by how seriously he took my report. I had been worried that the police would view this as a minor family dispute rather than a real crime, but Officer Burke treated it exactly as Linda had said he would, as a case of assault and battery. He took detailed notes as I described what had happened, asked me to provide a timeline of events, and photographed both my hair and the pictures that Linda had taken of the initial damage. He explained that in Ohio, forcibly cutting someone's hair without their consent was indeed classified as assault, and that the deliberate and extensive nature of what Rachel had done made it a particularly serious offense. "The fact that this occurred in your family home doesn't make it any less of a crime," Officer Burke explained. "Domestic violence and family abuse are taken very seriously by our department, and we will pursue charges against your stepmother if you choose to press them." The idea of Rachel facing criminal charges for what she had done to me was both terrifying and satisfying. Part of me worried about the impact on Emma and the way it would affect my already strained relationship with my father. But another part of me, the part that was tired of being treated like I didn't matter in my own family, wanted Rachel to face real consequences for her actions. Officer Burke explained the process of filing charges and the support services available to victims of domestic violence. He gave me contact information for a local advocacy organization and recommended that I consider applying for a protective order to prevent Rachel from contacting or approaching me while the case was pending. As he was finishing up his report, my phone started ringing. Dad's name appeared on the screen, and I realized that he must have come home for lunch and discovered the mess in the kitchen, or perhaps Rachel had called him to give her version of what had happened. I declined the call, not ready to deal with whatever story Rachel had concocted or whatever blame my father was preparing to assign to me for the morning's events. But the phone rang again immediately, and then again until I finally turned it off completely. "That's probably going to be your father," Officer Burke observed. "Family members often have strong reactions when they find out that police have been called about domestic situations. Do you have somewhere safe to stay while we sort this out?" I thought immediately of Grandma Helen's house, but I still wasn't ready to face her questions and devastation about what had happened to my hair. Instead, I called my best friend Ashley Chen, who was a senior at Riverside University and lived in an off-campus apartment about 20 minutes away. Ashley had been my closest friend since high school, and she knew better than anyone how difficult my relationship with Rachel had become over the past few months. When I explained what had happened that morning, she immediately offered to come pick me up and let me stay with her until I decided what to do next. I always knew that woman was psychotic, Ashley said when she arrived at the salon and saw my dramatically shortened hair. But I never thought she would actually physically attack you. This is completely insane, Jess. Linda refused to let me pay for the emergency haircut she had given me, saying that she was just glad she could help in some small way. She also gave me her personal phone number and made me promise to call if I needed anything else or if the situation with Rachel escalated further. You're braver than you know, she told me as Ashley and I prepared to leave. Standing up to an abuser takes incredible courage, and you should be proud of yourself for not letting her get away with this. As we drove to Ashley's apartment, I caught glimpses of my reflection in the passenger side mirror and felt a strange mixture of grief and liberation. My beautiful long hair was gone, and with it the physical connection to my mother and grandmother that had sustained me through the most difficult periods of my life. But I also felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of agency and control over my own life. For the first time since Rachel had entered our family, I had refused to accept her treatment of me. Instead of hiding the damage she had inflicted or pretending that it was somehow my fault, I had sought help from people who recognized her behavior for what it really was. I had documented the assault, involved law enforcement, and taken steps to protect myself from further harm. The afternoon at Ashley's apartment passed in a blur of phone calls and decision-making. The domestic violence advocate that Officer Burke had recommended called to discuss my options and help me understand the legal process ahead. She explained that cases like mine were more common than I might think, and that many abusers used physical alterations like forced haircuts as a way to humiliate and control their victims. By early evening, I had decided to move forward with pressing charges against Rachel. The advocate helped me understand that this wasn't about revenge or trying to break up my father's marriage. It was about establishing that Rachel's behavior was unacceptable and criminal, and ensuring that there were consequences for her actions that might prevent her from escalating her abuse in the future. I also made the difficult decision to apply for a temporary protective order that would legally prohibit Rachel from contacting me or coming near me while the criminal case was pending. The advocate explained that this would also extend protection to any location where I might be, including Grandma Helen's house, the college campus, and any workplace where I might be employed. The hardest call I made that day was to Grandma Helen. I had been dreading telling her what had happened, knowing how much my hair had meant to both of us and how angry she would be at Rachel for destroying something so precious. But I also knew that she deserved to hear about the situation from me rather than through the family gossip network that would inevitably spread the news throughout Riverside's close-knit community. When I explained what Rachel had done, Grandma Helen was silent for such a long time that I worried the call had been disconnected. When she finally spoke, her voice was shakier than I had ever heard it. "That woman laid hands on you in violence," she said slowly. "She attacked you in your own home and destroyed something she knew was precious to you. Jessica, darling, this is not about hair, this is about someone who believes she has the right to hurt you whenever she pleases." Grandma Helen's words echoed what Linda and Officer Burke and the domestic violence advocate had all told me throughout the day. What Rachel had done to me wasn't an overreaction to a family disagreement or a momentary loss of control. It was a deliberate act of violence, designed to establish dominance and control over me, and it represented a dangerous escalation in her pattern of psychological abuse. "I want you to come stay with me," Grandma Helen continued, "tonight, tomorrow night, for as long as you need. You are not going back to that house until that woman faces consequences for what she's done to you." As Ashley drove me across town to Grandma Helen's house that evening, I felt like I was crossing more than just the physical distance between her apartment and Elmwood Drive. I was crossing from the person I had been that morning, someone who accepted mistreatment in the name of family peace, to someone who was prepared to fight for her own dignity and safety. Grandma Helen was waiting on her front porch when we pulled into her driveway, and the sight of her familiar figure in the yellow glow of the porch light made me start crying again. But these tears felt different from the ones I had shed in Linda's salon earlier that day. They were tears of relief and gratitude rather than pure devastation. She hugged me carefully, running her fingers through my dramatically shortened hair with the same gentle touch she had used when I was a child. I expected her to cry when she saw the damage Rachel had inflicted, but instead her expression was one of fierce determination. "We're going to make sure she pays for this," she said quietly as she led me into the house that had always represented safety and unconditional love. "Nobody hurts my granddaughter and walks away without consequences." Nobody. That night, I lay in the same spare bedroom where I had spent countless childhood nights when Dad had to work late or travel for business. The room still smelled like Grandma Helen's lavender sachets, and the familiar comfort of her house helped me feel calmer than I had in months. But as I drifted off to sleep, I kept running my fingers through my shortened hair, mourning the loss of something that had connected me to the women in my family, and wondering what would happen when Dad inevitably chose Rachel's side over mine in the legal battle that was about to begin. The next morning brought a series of increasingly frantic phone calls from my father. I had turned my phone back on to coordinate with the domestic violence advocate and immediately found 17 missed calls and 12 text messages, all from Dad. The messages started with confusion about where I was and concern about the mess of hair he had found in the kitchen. They quickly escalated to anger about my overreaction to what he characterized as a simple disagreement about hair length. By the time I spoke with him around 10 o'clock that morning, his tone had shifted to barely controlled fury about my decision to involve the police in what he insisted was a private family matter. "Jessica, you need to come home right now and straighten this mess out," he said without any preamble or expression of concern about my well-being. "The police called the house last night looking for Rachel, and now she's terrified that she's going to be arrested over a simple misunderstanding." The fact that he was more worried about Rachel's emotional state than about the assault I had suffered told me everything I needed to know about where his loyalties lay. I tried to explain to him that what Rachel had done wasn't a misunderstanding, but a criminal act that had been witnessed and documented by multiple professionals. "Dad, she held me down and cut off my hair against my will," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "She knew how much it meant to me, and she destroyed it on purpose because she wanted to hurt me. This wasn't about helping me look more professional, this was about her asserting control over me through violence." But Dad was already dismissing my characterization of events, explaining that Rachel had told him I had been defiant and disrespectful about her reasonable request that I get a more mature haircut. According to his version of the story, Rachel had been forced to take action herself when I refused to comply with a simple parental directive. "She's your stepmother, Jessica," he said, his voice taking on the lecturing tone that I had come to dread. "She has every right to set standards for how you present yourself while you're living in our house. You're 22 years old, but you're still living under our roof and subject to our rules." I felt like I was talking to a stranger. This was the same man who had braided my hair for school pictures, who had always told me I was beautiful exactly as I was, who had promised to protect me from anyone who tried to hurt me. Now he was defending the woman who had physically attacked me and dismissing my trauma as teenage rebellion. "I'm not coming home, Dad," I told him firmly. "I'm staying with Grandma Helen until the protective order goes into effect, and then I'll figure out my next steps. But I'm not going back to a house where someone can assault me without consequences." The conversation ended with Dad threatening to cut off my college tuition payments if I didn't drop the charges against Rachel and return home immediately. It was the final confirmation that I had lost not just my hair that morning, but also the father I had loved and trusted my entire life. Over the next few days, word of what had happened spread quickly through Riverside's small community. The story took on a life of its own, with some people expressing shock and support for my decision to press charges, while others seemed to view it as an overreaction to a family dispute about grooming standards. The division in public opinion reflected the broader challenge of getting people to understand that domestic violence and family abuse could take many forms beyond the stereotypical image of a husband beating his wife. Many people struggled to see how forcibly cutting someone's hair could be considered a serious crime, especially when it occurred within a family context. But the legal system took a different view. Within a week of my initial report, Rachel was formally charged with assault and battery, and I was granted a temporary protective order that prohibited her from contacting me or coming within 100 yards of my location. The protective order also extended to Grandma Helen's house, my college campus, and any workplace where I might be employed. For the first time in months, I felt like I had some legal protection from Rachel's escalating pattern of psychological and now physical abuse. The criminal case would take months to work its way through the court system, but the immediate effect was that I finally felt safe from further attacks. Rachel could no longer show up at places where I was likely to be, and any attempt to contact me directly would result in additional criminal charges. As my hair slowly began to grow back over the following weeks, I started to rebuild my life, outside of the toxic environment that my family home had become. I increased my course load at Riverside Community College, applied for a part-time job at a local daycare center, and began seeing a counselor who specialized in helping victims of domestic violence process their experiences and develop healthy coping strategies.
The most difficult part of this period was accepting that my relationship with my father might be permanently damaged by his choice to support Rachel rather than his own daughter. I had always believed that family meant unconditional love and protection, but Dad had shown me that his version of family was conditional on my willingness to accept mistreatment without complaint. Grandma Helen became my anchor during this difficult transition. She never once suggested that I should forgive Rachel or try to reconcile with my father for the sake of family unity. Instead, she supported my decision to prioritize my own safety and well-being, even when it meant challenging the traditional expectations of family loyalty and forgiveness. Some bridges are meant to be burned, she told me one evening, as we sat in her garden, watching the roses she had taught me to tend bloom in the late spring sunshine. When someone shows you who they really are, believe them. Your father has shown you that he's willing to sacrifice your safety for his own comfort, and Rachel has shown you that she's capable of violence when she doesn't get her way. Those are not people you need to keep in your life. As difficult as it was to accept, I was beginning to understand that the family I had grown up believing in had been largely an illusion. My father's love had always been conditional on my willingness to make his life easier, and he had transferred that same expectation to his relationship with Rachel. Rather than protecting me from her abuse, he had enabled it by consistently choosing the path of least resistance. The realization was heartbreaking, but it was also liberating in ways I hadn't expected. For the first time in months, I was able to focus on my own goals and dreams without constantly worrying about managing family drama or tiptoeing around Rachel's volatile moods. I threw myself into my studies with renewed energy, applying to transfer to a 4-year university where I could complete my degree in early childhood education. I also began volunteering with the same domestic violence organization that had helped me navigate the legal process, using my own experience to help other young women who were struggling with family abuse. The work was emotionally challenging but deeply meaningful. I met women who had experienced every form of domestic violence imaginable, from traditional physical abuse to more subtle forms of psychological control and manipulation. Many of them had family members who refused to acknowledge the severity of their situations, or who pressured them to reconcile with their abusers for the sake of family unity. Through these connections, I began to understand that my experience with Rachel was part of a much larger pattern of abuse that affected women from all backgrounds and in all types of relationships. The specific tactics might vary, but the underlying goal was always the same: to establish dominance and control over another person through fear, intimidation, and violence. As summer approached and my court date drew nearer, I felt stronger and more confident than I had in years. My hair was growing back, though it would take many more months to reach its previous length. More importantly, I was growing back too, rediscovering the person I had been before Rachel's campaign of psychological warfare had worn down my self-esteem and sense of self-worth. The woman who would eventually walk into that courtroom to testify against her stepmother was not the same frightened, confused girl who had fled her family home with a butchered haircut and a broken heart. She was someone who had learned to recognize abuse for what it was, someone who understood that family relationships should be based on mutual respect rather than fear and control, and someone who was prepared to fight for her own dignity and safety regardless of the cost. The weeks leading up to the preliminary hearing felt like living in two different worlds simultaneously. During the day, I attended classes at Riverside Community College, worked part-time at Little Sprouts Daycare Center, and tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But underneath that routine existence, I was constantly preparing for a legal battle that would determine whether Rachel would face real consequences for what she had done to me. My lawyer, Michael Roberts, had taken my case after being referred by the Domestic Violence Advocacy Center. He was a soft-spoken man in his early 40s who specialized in family law and had extensive experience with domestic violence cases. During our first meeting, in his converted Victorian office downtown, he explained that assault cases involving family members were often more complex than those between strangers because of the emotional dynamics and social pressures involved. The defense will likely argue that this was a family disagreement that got out of hand rather than a premeditated assault. Michael warned me as we reviewed the evidence. They'll try to paint you as an overly dramatic young adult who called the police to get back at a stepmother you didn't like. We need to be prepared to demonstrate a clear pattern of escalating abuse and show that what happened wasn't an isolated incident.
Working with Michael to build the case forced me to confront aspects of Rachel's behavior that I had minimized or rationalized over the past 3 years. Together, we created a detailed timeline of incidents that showed how her psychological abuse had gradually intensified before culminating in the physical assault. The pattern was clear when laid out chronologically, but I realized how much energy I had spent convincing myself that each individual incident wasn't serious enough to warrant concern. The emotional manipulation had started almost immediately after Rachel moved into our house. She would make subtle comments about my appearance, my study habits, and my relationship with Grandma Helen that were designed to undermine my confidence without being overtly hostile. When I tried to discuss these comments with Dad, she would claim I was being oversensitive or taking her words out of context. As the months passed, Rachel had become bolder in her attempts to control various aspects of my life. She questioned my course selections, criticized my friends, and gradually established household rules that seemed designed specifically to make my life more difficult. The hair-cutting incident wasn't the spontaneous outburst that Dad and Rachel were now claiming it to be. It was the logical escalation of a campaign of psychological warfare that had been building for years. Michael also helped me understand the legal significance of the evidence that Linda Martinez had gathered at the salon. The photographs of my damaged hair, combined with Officer Burke's detailed report and Linda's professional testimony about the intentional nature of the damage, created a compelling case that this was a premeditated assault, rather than an accident or moment of poor judgment. The fact that Rachel threatened you the night before, then followed through on that threat the next morning, when your father wasn't present, shows clear intent and planning. Michael explained, this wasn't a heat-of-the-moment reaction to something you said or did. She deliberately waited for an opportunity when she could attack you without witnesses. One of the most challenging aspects of preparing for the hearing was dealing with the social pressure from people who thought I should drop the charges and try to reconcile with my family. Several of my father's colleagues approached me around town, expressing concern about the impact the legal proceedings were having on Dad's reputation and business relationships. Mrs. Patterson, who had been our neighbor for over a decade, cornered me at the grocery store one afternoon to lecture me about the importance of family forgiveness. Jessica, dear, I understand you're upset about your hair, she said, her tone dripping with condescension, but sending your stepmother to jail isn't going to solve anything. Sometimes we have to be the bigger person and let these things go for the sake of family unity. These conversations were infuriating and deeply hurtful. People who had known me since childhood were essentially telling me that I should accept being physically assaulted because maintaining the appearance of family harmony was more important than my safety and dignity. They seemed unable or unwilling to understand that what Rachel had done to me was a crime, not a minor family disagreement that could be resolved with an apology and a group hug. The pressure intensified when Emma's daycare teacher, Miss Rodriguez, called to express concern about the impact the family situation was having on my little sister. Emma had apparently been asking questions about why I didn't live at home anymore, and why Mommy seemed sad and angry all the time. I understand you're going through a difficult time with your family, Miss Rodriguez said carefully, but Emma is only 8 years old, and she doesn't understand why her big sister disappeared from her life. She keeps asking when you're coming home, and it's heartbreaking to see her confusion. The call about Emma was one of the hardest parts of the entire ordeal. I loved my little sister deeply, and the thought of her being confused and hurt by my absence was almost unbearable. But I also knew that returning to a house where I could be physically attacked without consequences wasn't safe for me, and it wouldn't be a healthy environment for Emma to witness either. Michael helped me understand that my decision to press charges against Rachel was actually an act of protection for Emma, as well as myself. Children who grow up in households where domestic violence is tolerated often develop unhealthy relationship patterns and may become either victims or perpetrators of abuse themselves. By establishing clear boundaries and consequences for Rachel's behavior, you're teaching Emma that violence is never acceptable, even within families, he explained. You're showing her that people who hurt others must face responsibility for their actions, and that's an important lesson for a young girl to learn. This perspective helped me feel more confident about my decision to move forward with the case, even though it meant maintaining distance from Emma during the legal proceedings. I hoped that someday, when she was older, she would understand that I had made these difficult choices, not just for my own safety, but to help create a world where she would never have to accept being treated the way Rachel had treated me. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late June. As the date approached, I found myself alternating between anxiety about the legal process and determination to see justice served. I had spent months preparing for this moment, and I was ready to tell my story in a forum where Rachel couldn't interrupt, dismiss, or retaliate against me. The night before the hearing, Grandma Helen and I sat on her front porch, watching the fireflies dance in her garden, while she braided my slowly growing hair into a neat style that would look professional in court. The ritual reminded me of all the Sunday evenings we had spent together when I was younger, and I felt a sense of continuity and strength that helped calm my nerves. "Tomorrow you're going to tell the truth about what happened to you," Grandma Helen said as she worked. "You're going to look that judge in the eye and explain exactly what Rachel did and why it was wrong. Don't let anyone make you feel ashamed or guilty for seeking justice. You have every right to expect safety and respect, especially from people who claim to love you." Her words gave me the courage I needed to face what was coming. I had spent too many months allowing Rachel and my father to convince me that I was overreacting, being too sensitive, or causing unnecessary drama. Tomorrow I would finally have the opportunity to present my side of the story to someone who was trained to recognize the
difference between a family disagreement and a criminal assault. The courthouse was an imposing brick building in downtown Riverside that I had passed hundreds of times but never entered. Walking through the metal detectors and security checkpoint made the gravity of the situation feel real in a way that all the preparation and paperwork hadn't. This wasn't just about my personal relationship with Rachel anymore. It was about whether our legal system would hold her accountable for committing a crime against another person. Michael met me in the hallway outside the courtroom, looking professional and confident in his navy suit. He reviewed the key points of my testimony one final time and reminded me to speak clearly and directly to the judge, focusing on the facts of what had happened rather than my emotional reactions. "Remember, the judge needs to determine whether there's probable cause to believe that Rachel committed assault and battery," he said. "We're not trying to prove the entire case today, just establish that a crime occurred and that there's sufficient evidence to move forward with a trial. Stay calm, tell the truth, and let the evidence speak for itself." When we entered the courtroom, I was surprised to see how many people were present. Dad was sitting in the front row behind the defense table, looking older and more tired than I had ever seen him. Rachel sat next to her lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman named Patricia Goldman, who had a reputation for aggressive defense tactics. Several other people I didn't recognize were scattered throughout the courtroom, probably other defendants and their families waiting for their cases to be called. The most shocking presence was my mother's sister, Aunt Jennifer, who had driven down from Cleveland specifically to attend the hearing. She caught my eye and nodded encouragingly, and I felt a surge of gratitude that at least one member of my extended family understood the seriousness of what had happened. Judge Martinelli was a middle-aged woman with silver hair and a no-nonsense demeanor who clearly had extensive experience dealing with domestic violence cases. She reviewed the charges and evidence briefly before calling me to the witness stand to describe what had happened on the morning of the assault. Standing in that witness box, looking out at a room full of people who were waiting to hear my story, I felt more nervous than I had ever been in my life. But as I began speaking, describing the events of that morning in clear factual terms, I found my voice growing stronger and more confident. I explained how Rachel had threatened me the night before, how she had waited until Dad left for work before cornering me in the kitchen, and how she had forcibly cut off my hair despite my protests and attempts to get away from her. I described the look of satisfaction on her face as she destroyed something she knew was precious to me, and the way she had immediately tried to shift blame onto me for forcing her to take such drastic action. Rachel's lawyer tried to interrupt several times, objecting to what she characterized as speculation about my stepmother's motivations rather than factual testimony about her actions. But Judge Martinelli allowed me to continue, noting that my observations about Rachel's demeanor and statements were relevant to establishing her intent and mental state during the assault. The most difficult part of my testimony was describing the aftermath of the incident and the way it had affected my relationship with my father and my ability to feel safe in my own home. I explained how Dad had immediately taken Rachel's side, dismissing my trauma and demanding that I apologize for involving the police in what he characterized as a private family matter. "Your Honor," I said, looking directly at Judge Martinelli, "what Rachel did to me that morning wasn't a parenting decision or a disagreement about hair length. It was a violent attack designed to humiliate and control me. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she enjoyed every minute of it. I should be able to live in my family's house without fear of being physically attacked, and when that's no longer possible, I have the right to seek protection from the legal system. After my testimony, Linda Martinez took the stand to describe her professional assessment of the damage to my hair and her decision to call the police. Her testimony was particularly powerful because she had no personal relationship with either me or Rachel, making her observations purely objective and professional. In 30 years of cutting hair, I have seen every type of damage imaginable, Linda testified. Accidents with scissors, chemical burns from home coloring attempts, even damage from fights between teenagers. What I saw when Jessica came into my salon that morning was clearly intentional and malicious. No one cuts hair in that pattern by accident or even in a moment of carelessness. The damage was designed to be as humiliating and difficult to repair as possible. Officer Burke's testimony provided the legal framework for understanding why Rachel's actions constituted criminal assault rather than a family discipline issue. He explained that under Ohio law, forcibly altering someone's physical appearance without their consent was classified as assault and battery, regardless of the relationship between the parties involved. The defendant clearly intended to cause physical harm and emotional distress to the victim, Officer Burke testified. The extensive nature of the damage, combined with the victim's obvious distress and the defendant's own statements about forcing compliance with her demands, demonstrated a clear pattern of abusive behavior that posed an ongoing threat to the victim's safety. When it was time for Rachel's defense, her lawyer argued that the incident had been blown out of proportion by an ungrateful stepdaughter who was looking for attention and trying to cause problems in her father's marriage. Patricia Goldman painted Rachel as a concerned parent figure who had been pushed to her breaking point by my alleged defiance and disrespect. Mrs. Thompson was simply trying to help her stepdaughter present a more professional appearance, Goldman argued. When Jessica refused to comply with reasonable grooming standards and became verbally abusive, Mrs. Thompson made a poor decision in the heat of the moment. This was not a premeditated assault but rather a regrettable incident that occurred during a family disagreement about appropriate boundaries and expectations. The defense strategy was exactly what Michael had predicted. They were trying to minimize the severity of what Rachel had done by characterizing it as a parenting decision that had gotten out of hand rather than a deliberate act of violence. They emphasized my age and the fact that I was living in my father's house, suggesting that Rachel had the authority to make decisions about my appearance whether I agreed with them or not. But Goldman's arguments fell apart when Judge Martinelli asked her to explain why, if this was simply a matter of parental authority, Rachel had threatened me the night before and waited until my father was gone before taking action. The premeditated nature of the assault, combined with the extensive evidence of intentional damage, made it impossible to characterize the incident as a spontaneous moment of poor judgment. Rachel herself testified briefly, trying to present herself as a victim of my alleged manipulation and disrespect. She claimed that I had been deliberately defiant about my appearance in order to cause problems in her marriage to my father, and that she had only cut my hair after I had become verbally abusive and threatening toward her. Watching Rachel lie under oath was both infuriating and enlightening. She delivered her false testimony with the same calm confidence she had used during 3 years of psychological manipulation, and I could see how someone who didn't know the full story might find her version of events plausible. She was skilled at presenting herself as reasonable and long-suffering while making me sound like an out-of-control young adult who was determined to destroy her family. But her testimony contained several inconsistencies that Michael was able to highlight during cross-examination. She couldn't explain why, if I had been verbally abusive and threatening, she hadn't called my father or the police for help. She also couldn't account for the systematic nature of the damage to my hair, which clearly indicated deliberate intent rather than a hasty reaction to an immediate threat. Most damaging to her credibility was her inability to explain why she had threatened me the night before, if the incident was truly spontaneous. When Michael pressed her about the timeline of events, she became flustered and contradicted several aspects of her original testimony. After both sides had presented their evidence, Judge Martinelli took a brief recess to review the testimony and evidence before making her ruling. Michael and I waited in the hallway, both feeling cautiously optimistic about how the hearing had gone but knowing that preliminary hearings could be unpredictable. When we returned to the courtroom, Judge Martinelli's demeanor was serious and focused as she delivered her decision. She had clearly given careful consideration to all the evidence and testimony, and her ruling addressed each of the key legal issues that had been raised during the hearing. After reviewing all the evidence presented today, this court finds that there is probable cause to believe that the defendant, Rachel Thompson, committed assault and battery against the victim, Jessica Thompson, on the morning in question, Judge Martinelli announced. The evidence clearly shows that the defendant used physical force to restrain the victim and deliberately inflicted damage to her person without consent. The premeditated nature of this assault, as evidenced by the defendant's threats the previous evening and her decision to act when no other family members were present, demonstrates a level of intent that goes far beyond any reasonable exercise of parental authority. The judge continued by noting that the extensive and systematic nature of the damage to my hair indicated that Rachel's actions were designed to cause maximum humiliation and psychological harm. She specifically rejected the defense argument that this was a spontaneous family disagreement, noting that the evidence showed clear planning and malicious intent. This court is deeply troubled by the defendant's apparent belief that her status as a stepparent gave her the right to use physical force against an adult family member who refused to comply with her demands. Judge Martinelli said, "Domestic violence takes many forms, and the law does not distinguish between different types of assault based on the relationship between the parties involved. The defendant's actions clearly meet the legal definition of assault and battery, and this case will proceed to trial." The ruling meant that Rachel would face criminal charges and a potential jail sentence if convicted. Judge Martinelli also extended my protective order and set a trial date for early fall, giving both sides time to prepare their cases more fully. As we left the courthouse, I felt a mixture of relief, vindication, and nervous anticipation about the trial ahead. The preliminary hearing had established that what Rachel did to me was indeed a crime, not just a family disagreement that had gotten out of hand. The legal system had taken my assault seriously and was prepared to hold Rachel accountable for her actions. Dad tried to approach me in the courthouse parking lot, but Michael intervened, reminding him that the protective order prohibited any contact between Rachel and me, and that included contact facilitated by third parties. Dad looked devastated as he walked away, and part of me felt sorry for him despite everything that had happened. Aunt Jennifer was waiting by her car, and she gave me a long hug before congratulating me on my courage in pursuing justice. "Your mother would be so proud of you," she said with tears in her eyes. "She always taught you to stand up for yourself, and that's exactly what you're doing. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for refusing to accept abuse." The drive back to Grandma Helen's house felt like a victory lap. We had won the first battle in what would likely be a longer war, but the preliminary hearing had validated everything I had believed about what Rachel had done to me. The judge had seen through Rachel's lies and manipulation, and she had recognized the assault for what it really was. That evening, Grandma Helen made my favorite dinner of pot roast and mashed potatoes, and we celebrated quietly on her back porch while fireflies danced in the garden. I felt more hopeful about the future than I had in months, knowing that I was finally taking control of my own life and refusing to accept treatment that was beneath my dignity. The road ahead would still be challenging. The trial would require me to relive the trauma of the assault in even greater detail, and there was always the possibility that a jury might be more sympathetic to Rachel's defense than Judge Martinelli had been. But I had proven to myself and to the world that I was strong enough to fight for justice, even when it meant standing up to people who were supposed to love and protect me. As I prepared for bed in the room that had become my sanctuary, I looked at my reflection in Grandma Helen's antique mirror and saw someone I barely recognized. My hair was still much shorter than it had been before Rachel's assault, but it was growing back healthy and strong. More importantly, the frightened, confused young woman who had fled her family home with a butchered haircut and a broken heart had been replaced by someone who understood her own worth and was prepared to defend it. The person looking back at me from that mirror was someone who had learned that love without respect was not really love at all, that family relationships should be based on mutual care rather than fear and control. And that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from people who refuse to treat you with basic human dignity. The preliminary hearing had been just the beginning of my journey toward justice, but it had already transformed me in ways that would last long after the legal proceedings were over. The months between the preliminary hearing and the trial passed in a blur of preparation, personal growth, and gradual healing. Summer turned to fall, and with it came a new chapter in my life that I had never imagined possible. I had enrolled as a full-time student at Ohio State University, finally pursuing my bachelor's degree in early childhood education after years of being held back by family drama and financial uncertainty. The transition to university life was both exhilarating and challenging. For the first time in years, I was surrounded by people who didn't know about my family's situation or the legal case pending against my stepmother. I could simply be Jessica Thompson, education major and aspiring teacher, rather than Jessica Thompson, the girl whose stepmother cut off her hair and ended up in court. My dorm mate Katie Morrison was a bubbly psychology major from Toledo who quickly became one of my closest friends. She noticed that I was always careful about my hair, never letting anyone else touch it, and spending extra time each morning styling it just right. When she finally asked about it one evening while we were studying for midterms, I found myself telling her the entire story. Katie's reaction was immediate and fierce. "That woman belongs in prison," she declared, setting down her psychology textbook with a slam. "What she did to you wasn't just assault, it was psychological torture. She deliberately targeted something she knew would hurt you the most, and then she tried to gaslight you into thinking it was your fault." Having friends like Katie who understood the gravity of what had happened helped me maintain perspective during the more difficult moments of the legal process. There were still people back in Riverside who thought I was overreacting, who believed that pressing charges against Rachel was somehow vindictive or unnecessary. But my new circle of friends at university, people who had no stake in maintaining family peace or protecting reputations, validated my decision to seek justice. Michael Roberts and I met regularly throughout the fall to prepare for the trial, which had been scheduled for early December. The prosecution had gathered additional evidence since the preliminary hearing, including testimony from other family members and acquaintances who had witnessed Rachel's pattern of controlling and manipulative behavior. Aunt Jennifer had provided a detailed statement about the changes she had observed in my father's behavior since his marriage to Rachel. She described how Dad had gradually become isolated from his extended family, canceling traditional holiday gatherings and declining invitations to family events where Rachel might feel uncomfortable or unwelcome. "David used to be such a devoted father," Aunt Jennifer had written in her statement. "He never missed Jessica's school events, always remembered important milestones, and frequently called to check on family members. After he married Rachel, all of that changed. It was like he became a different person, someone who prioritized keeping his new wife happy over maintaining relationships with people he had loved for decades." Even more powerful was testimony from Dr. Patricia Williams, the principal at Emma's elementary school, who had documented several concerning incidents involving Rachel's interactions with school staff. Williams described how Rachel had attempted to have Emma's teacher fired for supposedly showing favoritism to other students, and how she had demanded that the school implement special accommodations for Emma that were completely unnecessary and would have singled her out from her classmates. Mrs. Thompson displayed a pattern of behavior that suggested she viewed any attention given to other children as somehow diminishing her own daughter's status, Dr. Williams had testified during her deposition. She seemed unable to accept that Emma was simply one student among many, and she became hostile when school policies didn't bend to accommodate her demands. The most damaging evidence against Rachel came from an unexpected source. Carlos Mendez, the hairstylist who had been scheduled to cut my hair on the morning of the assault, had come forward with information about a phone call he had received from Rachel the day before the incident. According to Carlos, Rachel had called the salon claiming to be me and asking detailed questions about how to create a dramatic professional makeover that would involve cutting off most of my length. When Carlos had expressed surprise that I would want such a drastic change after years of maintaining long hair, Rachel had become agitated and hung up abruptly. She was clearly planning the assault in advance, Michael explained as we reviewed Carlos's testimony. "This wasn't a spontaneous reaction to your behavior that morning. She had already decided to cut your hair and was gathering information about how to make the damage as extensive as possible." The evidence painted a picture of Rachel as someone who was methodical and calculating in her abuse, someone who planned her attacks carefully and then worked to cover her tracks afterward. The hair-cutting incident wasn't an isolated moment of poor judgment, but rather the culmination of a long-term campaign of psychological warfare against a young woman she viewed as a threat to her control over her new family. As the trial date approached, I found myself experiencing a complex mixture of emotions. Part of me was eager to finally have my day in court, to tell my story to a jury, and see Rachel face real consequences for what she had done. But another part of me was terrified of reliving the trauma in such a public forum, of having my personal family business dissected by strangers who would ultimately decide whether justice would be served.
The night before the trial began, I had dinner with Grandma Helen at her house on Elmwood Drive. We sat in her familiar kitchen, surrounded by the same floral wallpaper and antique furniture that had provided comfort throughout my childhood, and tried to prepare emotionally for what was ahead. "Tomorrow, you're going to walk into that courtroom as the strong, confident woman you've become," Grandma Helen said as she served her famous apple pie. "You're not the frightened girl who ran away from her own home with a butchered haircut. You're someone who fought back, who refused to accept abuse, and who turned a terrible experience into an opportunity to protect other people from similar harm." She was right about how much I had changed over the past several months. The person who would testify tomorrow was not the same person who had been assaulted in her family's kitchen. I had grown stronger, more self-assured, and more committed to using my experience to help other victims of domestic violence. Through my work with the advocacy organization, I had met dozens of women who had experienced every form of abuse imaginable. Some had been physically beaten by intimate partners, others had been financially controlled by spouses who monitored every penny they spent, and still others had been psychologically tortured by family members who used manipulation and gaslighting to maintain power over them. Each story had taught me something new about the complex dynamics of abusive relationships and the courage required to break free from them. I had learned that abuse often escalates gradually, making it difficult for victims to recognize the danger until it becomes severe. I had also learned that abusers often target the things their victims value most, whether it's children, pets, careers, or in my case, physical appearance, that held deep emotional significance. The trial began on a cold December morning with jury selection. Michael had explained that this process was crucial, as we needed to find jurors who could understand that domestic violence takes many forms, and that family relationships don't excuse criminal behavior. Some potential jurors were dismissed because they expressed the opinion that family disputes should be resolved privately rather than through the legal system. Others were dismissed because they couldn't understand how cutting someone's hair could be considered a serious assault. But gradually, a panel of 12 jurors and 2 alternates was assembled, people who seemed capable of evaluating the evidence objectively and making a decision based on the law, rather than their personal feelings about family dynamics. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by District Attorney Rebecca Foster, a seasoned prosecutor who specialized in domestic violence cases. She laid out the timeline of events clearly and methodically, explaining how Rachel's behavior had escalated over time and culminated in a premeditated assault designed to inflict maximum psychological harm. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," DA Foster began, "this case is about power and control. It's about what happens when one person decides that another person's autonomy, dignity, and physical safety are less important than their own desire to dominate and intimidate. The defendant, Rachel Thompson, didn't cut the victim's hair because she was concerned about professional appearance or family standards. She cut it because she knew it would devastate Jessica Thompson, because she wanted to demonstrate her power over a young woman who had refused to submit to her increasingly controlling demands." Foster walked the jury through the evidence methodically, from the pattern of psychological abuse that had preceded the assault to the premeditated nature of the attack itself. She explained how Rachel had threatened me the night before, waited until my father was gone to work, and then cornered me in the kitchen, where she could carry out her plan without witnesses. "The defendant wants you to believe that this was a parenting decision that got out of hand," Foster continued, "but Jessica Thompson was 22 years old, an adult, who had every right to make her own decisions about her appearance. More importantly, even if Rachel Thompson had been Jessica's biological mother, no parent has the right to use physical force to alter their child's appearance against their will. What the defendant did was assault and battery, plain and simple, and the law applies equally to everyone regardless of their family relationships." The defense's opening statement, delivered by Patricia Goldman, focused on portraying me as a manipulative young woman who had blown a minor family incident out of proportion in order to destroy Rachel's marriage and reputation. Goldman painted Rachel as a loving stepmother who had been pushed to her breaking point by my alleged disrespect and defiance. "Rachel Thompson is not a criminal," Goldman argued. "She's a woman who married into a difficult situation, inheriting a stepdaughter who resented her presence and seemed determined to cause problems in her new marriage. On the morning in question, Mrs. Thompson was simply trying to help Jessica present a more professional appearance, and when Jessica became belligerent and abusive, Mrs. Thompson made a poor decision in a moment of frustration. This was not a premeditated assault, but rather a regrettable incident between family members who were struggling to establish boundaries and mutual respect."
Goldman's strategy was clear. She wanted the jury to see this as a family discipline issue, rather than a criminal assault. She emphasized my age, and the fact that I was living in my father's house, suggesting that Rachel had some legitimate authority over my behavior and appearance. She also implied that I had deliberately provoked the incident in order to create grounds for a lawsuit or criminal charges. The prosecution's case began with my own testimony, which lasted most of the first day of trial. Taking the witness stand in front of a packed courtroom was one of the most intimidating experiences of my life, but I was determined to tell my story clearly and honestly. I described the 3 years of psychological abuse that had preceded the assault, giving specific examples of how Rachel had gradually escalated her attempts to control and humiliate me. I explained how she had isolated me from my father, criticized every aspect of my appearance and behavior, and created an atmosphere of tension and fear in what had once been a loving home. When I got to the morning of the assault itself, I made sure to speak slowly and clearly, wanting the jury to understand exactly what had happened and why it was so traumatic. I described how Rachel had cornered me in the kitchen, grabbed my hair, and begun cutting it off, while I screamed and tried to get away from her. She wasn't trying to give me a haircut, I testified, looking directly at the jury. She was trying to hurt me in the most devastating way possible. She knew that my hair represented my connection to my mother and grandmother, and she wanted to destroy that connection because she saw it as a threat to her control over our family. The most difficult part of my testimony was describing the aftermath of the assault and the way my father had immediately taken Rachel's side. I had to explain how the man who had raised me and claimed to love me had dismissed my trauma and demanded that I apologize to my attacker for seeking
Help from the police. I lost more than just my hair that morning, I told the jury. I lost my father, my home, and my sense of safety within my own family. Rachel didn't just assault me physically, she destroyed the family relationships that had sustained me throughout my life. Patricia Goldman's cross-examination was aggressive and often hostile, designed to make me appear vindictive and unreliable. She questioned my motives for pressing charges, suggested that I had exaggerated the extent of Rachel's psychological abuse, and implied that I had somehow provoked the hair-cutting incident through my own behavior. Isn't it true, Miss Thompson, that you resented your stepmother from the moment she entered your family? Goldman asked, her tone sharp and accusatory. I tried to accept her, I replied honestly. I wanted my father to be happy, and I hoped we could build a positive relationship. But it became clear very quickly that Rachel saw me as an obstacle to be eliminated rather than a stepdaughter to be welcomed. Goldman pressed me about specific incidents, trying to find inconsistencies in my testimony or evidence that I had been deliberately difficult or disrespectful. But Michael and I had prepared thoroughly for this cross-examination, and I was able to respond to her questions calmly and consistently. Miss Thompson, don't you think it's possible that your stepmother was simply trying to help you present a more mature professional appearance? Goldman asked. No, I replied firmly. If Rachel had been concerned about my appearance, she would have discussed it with me respectfully, or suggested that I make an appointment with a professional stylist. Instead, she threatened me, cornered me when I was alone, and physically attacked me while I begged her to stop. That's not help, it's assault. The prosecution's case continued with testimony from Linda Martinez, Officer Burke, and the various other witnesses who had documented the assault and its aftermath. Each witness reinforced the central themes of the case: that Rachel's actions were premeditated and malicious, that the damage to my hair was intentionally extensive and humiliating, and that this was a criminal assault rather than a family discipline issue. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a psychologist who specialized in domestic violence, testified about the psychological impact of the assault and the pattern of abuse that had preceded it. She explained how abusers often target their victims' sources of strength and identity, and how the deliberate destruction of my hair represented a calculated attack on my sense of self and my connection to my family heritage. The defendant's choice to cut the victim's hair was not random, Dr. Mitchell testified. Hair often carries deep cultural and personal significance, particularly for women. By destroying something that represented the victim's connection to her deceased mother and beloved grandmother, the defendant was inflicting psychological trauma that would last far beyond the physical healing process. The defense case was brief and largely unsuccessful. Rachel took the stand in her own defense, but her testimony was unconvincing and filled with the same inconsistencies that had undermined her credibility during the preliminary hearing.
She continued to insist that she had been trying to help me look more professional, but she couldn't explain why she had threatened me the night before, or why she had waited until my father was gone to take action. Goldman also called my father as a witness, hoping that his testimony would support the defense theory that I had been a difficult stepdaughter who had brought the incident on myself. But Dad's appearance on the witness stand was a disaster for the defense. Under questioning from Goldman, Dad tried to portray Rachel as a loving stepmother who had been patient with my alleged behavioral problems. But during cross-examination, DA Foster exposed the extent to which he had enabled Rachel's abuse and failed to protect his own daughter from assault. Mr. Thompson, when your daughter came to you the night before the assault and told you that your wife had threatened to cut her hair, what did you do to protect her? Foster asked. Dad squirmed uncomfortably in the witness chair. I thought it was just a disagreement about hair length, he mumbled. I suggested that maybe Jessica should consider a more professional style. So when your wife threatened to physically assault your daughter if she didn't comply with her demands, you sided with your wife rather than protecting your child. It wasn't a threat of assault, Dad protested weakly. It was just family discipline. Mr. Thompson, your daughter was 22 years old at the time of this incident. In what universe is a 22-year-old adult subject to family discipline involving forced alteration of her physical appearance? Dad had no good answer to that question, and his testimony actually reinforced the prosecution's case rather than helping the defense. The jury could see that he had prioritized his marriage over his daughter's safety, and that his failure to protect me had enabled Rachel's escalating abuse. The closing arguments took place on a Friday afternoon in mid-December. DA Foster delivered a powerful summation that tied together all the evidence and reminded the jury that domestic violence takes many forms, all of which are serious crimes regardless of the family relationships involved. Rachel Thompson committed a premeditated assault against Jessica Thompson, Foster argued. She planned it in advance, she carried it out when she knew there would be no witnesses, and she inflicted extensive damage designed to cause maximum psychological harm. The fact that she was married to the victim's father doesn't give her the right to assault another adult, any more than being someone's husband gives a man the right to beat his wife. Foster emphasized that convicting Rachel was about more than just punishing one abuser. It was about sending a message that domestic violence would not be tolerated in any form, and that victims who came forward to report abuse would be taken seriously by the legal system. Patricia Goldman's closing argument was a last-ditch attempt to convince the jury that this was a family matter that had been blown out of proportion by an ungrateful stepdaughter and an overzealous legal system. She argued that Rachel's actions, while regrettable, didn't rise to the level of criminal assault and that a conviction would criminalize normal family discipline. But her arguments fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence that this was a premeditated attack rather than a spontaneous family disagreement. The jury had heard testimony about Rachel's threats, her methodical planning, and the extensive nature of the damage she had inflicted. They had also seen the photographs of my butchered hair and heard professional testimony about the intentional nature of the assault. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict. When the foreman stood to announce that they had found Rachel Thompson guilty on all charges, I felt a wave of relief and vindication that brought tears to my eyes. Judge Martinelli scheduled sentencing for the following month, but she immediately revoked Rachel's bail and ordered her taken into custody pending the sentencing hearing. As the bailiff led Rachel away in handcuffs, she turned to glare at me with the same cold hatred I had seen in her eyes on the morning she attacked me. The guilty verdict was covered extensively in the local media, and the reaction from the community was sharply divided. Some people expressed support for my decision to pursue justice and praised the verdict as an important step in recognizing domestic violence in all its forms. Others continued to view the conviction as an overreaction to a family dispute and criticized the legal system for interfering in private family matters. The sentencing hearing in January was emotional and cathartic. Judge Martinelli sentenced Rachel to 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of probation and mandatory anger management counseling. She also ordered Rachel to pay restitution for my medical expenses, counseling costs, and the economic impact of the assault on my education and career. But more important than the specific sentence was Judge Martinelli's statement from the bench, which validated everything I had experienced and fought for over the past year. Domestic violence is a serious crime regardless of the form it takes, Judge Martinelli declared. The defendant's actions were not parental discipline or family guidance, they were a calculated assault designed to humiliate and control the victim.
This court wants to send a clear message that such behavior will not be tolerated, and that victims of domestic violence will find justice in our legal system regardless of their relationship to their attackers. After the sentencing, I stood on the courthouse steps with Michael Roberts, Grandma Helen, and Aunt Jennifer, feeling a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. The legal process was finally over, and justice had been served. Rachel would face real consequences for what she had done to me, and other victims of domestic violence would see that the system could work when people had the courage to come forward. But the most important victory wasn't the guilty verdict or the prison sentence. It was the person I had become through the process of fighting for justice. The frightened, confused young woman who had fled her family home with a butchered haircut had been transformed into someone who understood her own worth and was prepared to defend it against anyone who tried to diminish it. 6 months after Rachel's sentencing, I graduated from Ohio State University with my bachelor's degree in early childhood education. Grandma Helen, Aunt Jennifer, and even some of my professors from Riverside Community College came to the ceremony to celebrate this milestone that had seemed impossible during the darkest days of the legal battle. As I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I thought about all the challenges I had overcome to reach this moment. The assault had derailed my life for a time, but it had also taught me lessons about resilience, courage, and the importance of standing up for what's right that would serve me well in my career as an educator. I accepted a position teaching first grade at an elementary school in Columbus, where I could use my experience with domestic violence to help identify and support children who might be facing similar situations at home. My own trauma had given me insights into the signs of abuse that many teachers miss, and I was determined to be the kind of advocate for vulnerable children that I had needed during my own difficult family situation. My relationship with my father remained complicated and distant. He had attended the sentencing hearing but had not spoken to me afterward. According to mutual acquaintances, he was struggling with guilt about his role in enabling Rachel's abuse and his failure to protect his own daughter when she needed him most. Emma, now 9 years old, was living with Dad and adjusting to life without Rachel. Through carefully supervised visits arranged by a family counselor, I was gradually rebuilding my relationship with my little sister and helping her understand that what had happened wasn't her fault. It was important to me that Emma learn early that healthy relationships are based on mutual respect and that no one has the right to hurt another person, even within families. 2 years after the trial, I received an unexpected letter from Rachel herself. Written from the state correctional facility where she was serving her sentence, the letter was a rambling attempt to justify her behavior and shift blame onto me for the consequences she was facing. "You destroyed my family and my life over a simple haircut," she wrote. "I hope you're satisfied with the damage you've caused to everyone involved, including your own father and sister." I read the letter once and then threw it away. Rachel still didn't understand what she had done wrong, and she probably never would. But her lack of remorse only reinforced my conviction that pursuing justice had been the right decision. People who are capable of genuine change don't blame their victims for the consequences of their own criminal behavior. On the 3rd anniversary of the assault, I visited Linda Martinez at Serenity Hair Studio. My hair had grown back to nearly its original length, and Linda had been cutting it regularly to maintain healthy growth and a professional style that served me well in my teaching career. "You know," Linda said as she trimmed my ends, "you're one of the strongest people I've ever met. What you went through would have broken a lot of people, but you turned it into something positive. You should be proud of yourself." As I looked at my reflection in Linda's mirror, I saw someone I was indeed proud of. My hair was beautiful and healthy, representing not just its original connection to my mother and grandmother, but also my own journey toward healing and self-advocacy. The woman looking back at me had learned that true strength comes not from avoiding conflict, but from standing up for what's right even when it's difficult and painful. That evening, I sat in my own apartment, grading papers from my first grade students and planning lessons for the following week. My life was peaceful, purposeful, and entirely my own. I had built a career I loved, surrounded myself with people who treated me with respect and kindness, and learned to set boundaries that protected my physical and emotional well-being. Sometimes people ask me if I regret pressing charges against Rachel, if I think the whole ordeal was worth the pain and family disruption it caused. My answer is always the same: I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret doing it. Rachel's assault was a crime, and crimes should have consequences regardless of the family relationships involved. More importantly, my decision to seek justice had ripple effects that extended far beyond my own situation.
The case received enough media attention to raise awareness about domestic violence in non-traditional forms, and I know that other victims found the courage to come forward because they saw that the legal system could work for them too. I also know that my decision to fight back probably prevented Rachel from escalating her abuse toward Emma or future victims. Abusers don't typically get better on their own, they usually get worse until someone stops them. By holding Rachel accountable for her actions, I may have saved other people from experiencing what I went through. The little girl who used to sit in Grandma Helen's kitchen, learning to braid friendship bracelets while listening to stories about strong women, had grown up to become one of those strong women herself. My hair had grown back, but more importantly, I had grown back too. I had rebuilt my life on my own terms, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than trying to control and diminish me. As I prepared for bed that night, I looked at the framed photo on my nightstand, showing Grandma Helen and me on my college graduation day. We were both smiling broadly, and my hair was pulled back in the same elegant style she had taught me to create years earlier. The photo represented everything I had fought for: the right to be myself, the freedom to make my own choices, and the knowledge that I was worthy of love and respect exactly as I was. The woman who had been assaulted in her family's kitchen 3 years earlier was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. That transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. But it had been worth every difficult moment, every tear shed, and every challenge overcome. Justice had been served, healing had occurred, and life had moved forward in ways that were better than I could have imagined during those dark days when my world seemed to be falling apart. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the catalysts for the best things that follow, and sometimes the people who try to break us end up making us unbreakable instead. Following Rachel's conviction and imprisonment, my life transformed in ways I never anticipated. The constant anxiety that had plagued me for years gradually dissolved, replaced by a newfound confidence in my ability to control my own destiny. I threw myself into my teaching career at Riverside Elementary, where working with young children became more than just a profession. It became my mission to protect other vulnerable kids from experiencing what I had endured. Among my first-grade students was Sophie Martinez, a bright 7-year-old, whose behavior patterns immediately caught my attention. Sophie was obsessively protective of her long, beautiful hair, and would withdraw into herself whenever there was conflict in the classroom. During parent conferences, I met her mother Carmen and stepfather Robert, whose domineering personality and critical comments about Sophie's appearance triggered every alarm bell in my mind. Robert Martinez reminded me disturbingly of Rachel. He dominated conversations, criticized Sophie for excelling in areas where she was actually performing well, and made disparaging remarks about modern parenting being too soft. Most concerning was how Sophie instinctively touched her hair whenever Robert spoke, displaying the same protective behavior I had developed around Rachel. I began documenting everything methodically, keeping detailed notes about Sophie's behavioral changes, and building a relationship with Carmen through informal conversations. The breakthrough came during playground duty, when Sophie confided that her hair was her crown, connecting her to strong women in her family, but that Daddy Robert said she was being vain and worthless for caring about her appearance. The crisis arrived on a Monday morning, when Sophie came to school wearing a baseball cap, her beautiful long hair hacked off in the same jagged, deliberate pattern I recognized from my own assault. The little girl was traumatized and silent, terrified to speak because Robert had threatened that she would never see her mother again if she told anyone what happened. I immediately contacted Child Protective Services and Janet Foster, the same worker who had helped during my case. Sophie eventually revealed that Robert had exploded in rage the previous evening, dragging her to the bathroom and cutting off her hair with kitchen scissors, while she screamed, calling her a little tramp who needed to focus on important things instead of vanity. The investigation moved swiftly. Robert was arrested for child abuse, and Sophie was placed with her grandmother, while Carmen received counseling and established independence from her abuser. My testimony about the documented pattern of psychological abuse helped secure protective measures for both mother and daughter. 6 months later, I received a handwritten note from Sophie with a photograph showing her confident smile and growing pixie cut. She thanked me for helping her tell the truth, and said I had taught her that brave people help others be brave too. Reading her note, I realized my trauma had transformed into something powerful and protective. This experience led to speaking opportunities at education conferences, where I shared my story publicly for the first time since the trial. I explained how surviving family abuse had enhanced rather than hindered my effectiveness as an educator, teaching me to recognize subtle warning signs that preceded serious violence. My presentations helped other teachers understand family abuse dynamics and gave them courage to report their own suspicions about at-risk students. 5 years after the trial, I was promoted to assistant principal, implementing school-wide policies for identifying and supporting abused children. Our protocols became a model for other districts, and I consulted on similar programs across Ohio and neighboring states. My personal experience had evolved into systematic change that protected countless vulnerable students. On the 10th anniversary of Rachel's assault, I visited Linda Martinez for our annual hair appointment. Linda, nearing retirement, reflected that I was the first assault victim she had called police for who followed through to conviction, creating a precedent that encouraged other women to seek justice. Looking in her mirror, I saw someone genuinely proud of who she had become. That evening I attended Emma's high school graduation, where my sister delivered the valedictorian speech. Now 18 and college-bound on a full scholarship, Emma had grown into a confident young woman. We had rebuilt our relationship into something stronger and more honest than before Rachel's assault tore our family apart. Dad attended the ceremony too, sitting alone several rows behind us. We had achieved tentative reconciliation over the years, though our relationship bore permanent scars from his choice to support Rachel over his own daughter. He had expressed remorse and paid for my college education as restitution, but some betrayals can never be fully healed. After graduation, Emma hugged me tightly and whispered, "I'm so proud to be your sister. You taught me it's never okay to let someone hurt you, even if they're family. That's the most important lesson I've learned." Standing in that gymnasium, watching Emma begin her journey toward independence, I felt profound peace about my choices and life's direction. The assault had been devastating, but it revealed strength and resilience that might never have emerged otherwise. Rachel had been released from prison after 14 months and faded into irrelevance. I heard occasional updates through acquaintances about her move to another state and new marriage, but her circumstances no longer interested me. She had faced legal consequences, and I had moved far beyond needing additional validation or closure. The frightened young woman who fled her family home with butchered hair was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. This transformation hadn't happened overnight, and wasn't easy, but it was worth every difficult moment, tear shed, and challenge overcome. Driving home through Riverside's familiar streets, I reflected on my journey to contentment and purpose. My hair had grown back, my career flourished, my relationships were built on mutual respect rather than fear, and I had learned to transform painful experiences into protection for others. Justice had been served, healing occurred, and life moved forward in ways better than I could have imagined during those dark days when everything seemed hopeless. Sometimes our worst experiences become catalysts for our greatest achievements, and sometimes those who try to destroy us end up making us unbreakable instead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.